Hello and good afternoon. In this tutorial I'm going to talk about the development of England. You can find the information in your book on pages 393 to 395. The main concepts I'm going to cover in this tutorial are what is the land of the Angles, what is the Battle of Hastings and why it's important, what is the Magna Carta, and what is the Model Parliament. Okay, so the beginning of the history of England, we go all the way back to 800 AD. I know this is a big jump back in time, and I will remind you of the Germanic tribes once again. So the Germanic tribes that settled in England around 800 AD, the two main groups were the Angles and the Saxons. You can see on the map here the areas that they come from. So the Angles come from this place, Anglia, which is part of modern-day Denmark, and the Saxons come from what is, the northwestern part of Germany. And these two groups settled in England. At first they were not united, but over time they became united and they formed the Anglo-Saxons. Okay, this is also a term we use for British people nowadays. Okay, so the Anglo-Saxons live here in England, and between the years more or less 800 until 1000, they were disrupted by invasions from the Vikings. The Vikings came from Denmark, this part, and they used to attack and raid the Anglo-Saxon settlements. Finally, this came to an end with the king called Canute. He manages to unite the Anglo-Saxons with the Vikings to make one kind of race of people, and they become assimilated. So he brings peace to England. The name England comes from the name Land of the Angles, which a king, Alfred the Great, named the territory Land of the Angles after his Germanic tribe. You might also see the origin of the word in the French Angleterre, I don't know how to pronounce it, my French is awful, which later became England from the dialect that the Germanic tribe spoke there. Okay, so after Canute in 1016 had united the Angles and the Saxons with the Vikings, everything went along fine for a period of time until 1066. In this year, the English king died and there was no heir, so a fight broke out amongst two men that thought that they should be the next king of England. One of these men was called William the Conqueror. He was a Norman, and you can see on the map here that Normandy is this part of France, but he had relations who were English, and therefore he thought he was the rightful heir to the throne. And the other guy was called Harold, who was an Angle. So William the Conqueror, the Norman, and Harold Godwinson went to war in a battle called the Battle of Hastings in 1066. There is a tapestry called the Bayeux Tapestry, which is a piece of material with embroidery on it that depicts the entire Battle of Hastings. Here you can see a section of it, of the Anglo-Saxons who supported Harold Godwinson versus William the Conqueror. And in another piece of the tapestry, which I'm going to show you now, you can see how Harold Godwinson ends up dead. Perhaps you can see here, this is an arrow and it's going through his eye. This is actually how he dies. And in the end, William the Conqueror wins the Battle of Hastings in 1066 and becomes the new King of England. So William the Conqueror is the King of England. He unites Normandy and England, the Norman people with the Anglo-Saxons, and he consolidates the king's power in England by trying to reduce the power of the nobility in England and increase his power. He does this by taking away lands of the nobles and putting friends of his, Norman lords and friends, in their place. Okay, so after William the Conqueror, his descendants and the next kings have two main aims. One is to increase the lands that they have in France, so Normandy, and expand their territory there, and also to make sure they have more power than the nobles. The next important king that we're going to look at is called Henry II. Henry II is important because he starts implementing more democratic processes in England. He does this by introducing juries. This is when there is a court case, people of the normal population go to the trial and they decide whether the person is innocent or guilty. And then different decisions that were made during these jury trials end up being incorporated into something called common law, like the list of laws of the land. So here you can see a painting of Henry II and also an image that shows a jury trial. Okay, so you have the people listening here to what is happening in the trial and a judge. Okay, so now we move on to the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta is a legal document signed by a king of England called John Softsword and the nobles of the time. But first I have to tell you a little bit of the story leading up to the Magna Carta. So when Henry II dies, his son, Richard the Lionheart, takes over as king. Hopefully you remember who he is from the Third Crusades. Anyway, he was a pretty good king and leader, but when he dies, his younger brother, John, known as John the Softsword, takes over. Perhaps you can guess from the nickname Softsword that he wasn't a very good ruler, okay? He wasn't a good military commander, he was cruel and he kind of annoyed people. So he raised the taxes hugely against the nobles in order to finance different wars that he was participating in an attempt to conquer more land, but he wasn't successful. And so the nobles got really angry at this and they revolted, and this led to the signing of the Magna Carta. The intention of the Magna Carta for the nobles was to make sure that they had rights so that the king couldn't have too much power over them and couldn't tax them too much. However, later it was interpreted by ordinary people to apply to them, and therefore it gave almost everybody in the population certain basic human rights. And a lot of the constitutions of democratic countries nowadays is based on this document. So it guaranteed things such as trial, so that if you're accused of a crime or something that you are guaranteed a trial, guaranteed different property rights and taxation rights. So it really limited the king's power immensely. So here you can see a picture of the Magna Carta with its tiny writing on the manuscript. Okay, so after John Softsword came King Edward I. He continued implementing democratic changes, although he didn't mean to, it just sort of happened. He decided he wanted to go to war, and yet he needed money. Normally the way to raise money for war was to raise taxes. However, he cannot just raise the taxes however he wants because of the Magna Carta. So he has to get around the laws in the Magna Carta to allow himself to raise taxes for his war, and he decides to call representatives from different social classes across all of England to a meeting where they discuss and vote on whether he can raise the taxes or not. And this becomes the Model Parliament. And this meeting of the Model Parliament takes place in 1295. It's called the Model Parliament because it's like the first example of it. It wasn't intentional, it just happened, but then this practice continued after this fact, when kings needed to make important decisions and they couldn't due to rights laid out in the Magna Carta. They would call the representatives together to discuss and decide. Okay, so the House of Lords and House of Commons was how the Parliament was divided into two parts. The House of Lords was made up of the nobles and the bishops, and the House of Commons was the more ordinary people, the knights and the burgesses. So representatives of these groups of people came to the Parliament to discuss and decide things with the king. The burgesses are like the middle class people. This is a new class of people that arose during the commercial revolution in the Middle Ages. Okay, so here's the revision sheet. These are the absolute essentials you need to know. I have answered all these questions in the video, so please make sure you understand them. If you don't, you can ask me in class. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.